Hello, my friends. Welcome to Pensive Politics, Mr. Watson. I am your host, Christian Watson, and once again, this is going to be one of the few times that you actually hear me say that before our show is rebranded, because as I mentioned in my last interview with Mr. Adam Coleman, and as I'm going to mention in this interview, the show is going under a significant rebranding. We will be a live show every Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. I'm trying to figure out times, but I'll get times eventually. And we will be broadcast on YouTube. And later, after the live broadcast, it'll be uploaded as a podcast and all your favorite podcasting platforms. But today, my friends, I have with me Mr. P.F. Jung, Paul, who is the host of a YouTube channel also called P.F. Jung. He is an adherent of Dr. Jordan Peterson. I hope that's a good way to describe you. And
yes,
I first came upon him by watching a video he did critiquing libertarianism. And I thought that he was actually quite uncharitable in his critiques.
The title was, if you remember the title, the only person dumber than a socialist was a libertarian.
Yeah, exactly. And so obviously I took great umbrage at that statement. But, Mr. Paul here decided to follow me on YouTube for a while, and he decided that he actually thought my content was okay, which is more than I get from many people.
More than okay, so, I'd say, yes.
Paul, thank you so much for being here. And why don't you tell folks a little bit about you before we get into our topic?
Yeah, well, like you said, I'm definitely an adherent to Jordan Peterson's philosophy. I started my YouTube channel probably 7 months ago in the midst of the pandemic and a lot of the, summer riots and protests and whatnot. Mm-hmm. When a lot of my friends were posting on Facebook, oh, if you believe this, you're a bad person. You're a communist. If you believe this, you're a racist. If you believe this, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. So I was pretty stressed by that. So I figured I'd post some videos, and I've always been interested in abstract ideas, politics, philosophy, all that. So that's basically the gist of my channel. I do try to approach things from like a mental health perspective. I think my interest in abstract ideas is only there insofar as those ideas can be applied to benefit an everyday person's mental health. I think that's ultimately, from my perspective, what I find valuable. So,
sure,
and absolutely. That definitely applies to libertarianism and the policies and implications of those ideas.
Yeah, and I've never really heard libertarianism critiqued from a mental health perspective before. So perhaps this will be a very interesting discourse. Sure. Before I get into the topic, let me just say something real quick. A lot of people embark and endeavor in debates and other oratory contests for the purposes of self-aggrandizement. Let me make something very clear to anyone who's watching this. I have no interest in destroying anyone. Neither does Paul. I have no interest in humiliating anyone, and I assume neither does Paul. I have only an interest in finding the truth. It was the great John Stuart Mill who proclaimed in Chapter 3 of On Liberty, one of the best in general political treatises ever penned by anyone. He proclaimed that the only way to escape falsehood is by merging discourse and experience. So you can have experience, but if there is not discourse to back that up, then your experience is impotent insofar as it teaches you anything, or insofar as it actually broadens your horizons. It does not. So that is why I undertaken these sort of contentious conversations, not for self-aggrandizement, but because I understand the importance of the thought experiment. I understand the importance of discourse and experience to understanding the world. And so that's just something I wanted to put out there, because a lot of people like to dunk on folks, and this is not what this conversation is going to be. This conversation is going to be a amiable, contentious, I imagine, talk about a very important topic that I will get into right now. So the topic of our discussion is understanding and weighing the relationship between rationality and self-interest as it relates to the libertarian political structure. That is it. So as we get into this, I just want to start off by asking you, Paul, what are your initial thoughts on the topic? And what exactly, you can also begin with this if you want. You can go any way you want. What exactly do you have against libertarianism?
Sure. So let's see. Well, I'll start with the second part. What do I have against libertarianism? Well, I used to be a libertarian. I have a picture of Milton Friedman on my wall. My wall it's Jordan Peterson, Malcolm X, Milton Friedman, Jane Goodall. So it's a diverse cast of characters, you could say. I always liked libertarianism because the basic concept was fiscally conservative, socially liberal, right? Low taxes, get the government out of our finances, and, get the government out of our personal lives. Generally speaking, let's let people dictate, decide what to do with their own lives. I would say, as a rule of thumb, I would describe myself as a libertarian, and in that vein of, generally speaking, let's let people make their own decisions. But my criticisms, I guess, would kind of be at the axiomatic level, the fundamental presuppositions. And so, like, the first one I would say is, and again, there's many different strands of libertarianism, so I don't necessarily know to what degree you abide by these axioms, and we'll have to iron that out. But the idea that people are rational, or mostly rational, and that people generally, human beings pursue their own self-interest. I agree, people are greedy, so to speak, and pursue their own self-interest. I think that's a biological evolutionary fact. I think people on the far left have a hard time accepting that, and they want to believe people are naturally, charitable and what's the word? There's an evolutionary term for generosity of some kind. But I guess my first criticism, and we could just go into this, is the idea of self-interest. I think self-interest is in some ways a paradox, because and this is a Jordan Peterson idea. I wouldn't necessarily, he doesn't levy this as a critique against libertarianism, but I'm kind of putting it in that perspective. Self-interest is a paradox because what's good for you today is not necessarily what's good for you 5 years from now, or what's good for you 20 years from now. And the idea is you are a community across time, right? You're who you are today, you're who you are 3 years from now. And the probability that the average person knows what is in their self-interest, meaning what is best for them over their entire lifetime, or even over a brief period of time, is, I would say, it's low. And so the idea that people, that if we simply allow people to make their own and I got to be careful about how I word things, because of course we should allow people to make their own decisions, but I think there is a significant role for institutions. I like this term called structural rationality, the idea that there are institutions set up that essentially, and I don't necessarily have this fleshed out. That's kind of in part why I want to discuss this with you. But the idea is, I guess the first one we can take apart is, what do you think about that idea that self-interest is somewhat paradoxical, because you can't calculate what's good you don't necessarily know what's good for you 20 years from now. And I would say most people don't, as evidenced by the fact that people make all kinds of terrible decisions, and we have skyrocketing rates of mental health issues. And if people knew what was best for them, you wouldn't have those issues. So I think there is a necessary to defer to, whether it's religious institutions or something like that.
Right. Okay. So let me just restate your contention to you so I can make sure we're getting this correct. So the first axiom that you want to challenge that is essential to libertarianism, which you are correct, it is essential, is the axiom of self-interest. And you believe self-interest is paradoxical because there's no possible way that someone can know right now, with the material and the structure of right now, be able to predict their self-interest or understand their self-interest 10, 20, 30 years down the line. That's right. Your argument.
I think that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's definitely, yes, I agree with that.
Okay, that's your argument. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. There are a few things I want to mention. Okay. Think of a hammer, okay, for a moment. One hammer that is passed around by multiple people throughout a lifetime. Does the hammer's purpose remain even if it changes hands and it is used for different projects? Or is the hammer's essential nature somehow changed and shifted because the hammer has been used in ways that the hammer maker, at the very genesis of the hammer's life, at the very genesis of that time when thought reached matter and matter reached form and the hammer came into existence, he couldn't predict all of that? Does the hammer's essential nature still remain the same? Yes or no? What would you say?
Does the hammer's essential
yes
nature remain the same? The physical matter of it, the purpose certainly could change. You could use a hammer to build something or kill somebody.
Well, we're not talking. It's not a matter of purpose. Does its essential function, perhaps that's the better word, remain the same?
I think the function is dependent on the person using it. So in that sense, I would say no, because if the hammer passes hands, the function would be dependent on the person using it.
A hammer has a very particular way of what it's supposed to be used. Now, if incidentally someone decides to use it for a purpose that it was not built for, that doesn't necessarily mean the hammer becomes for that purpose. For example, I have a car. Cars are meant for transportation. If I go out and try and run into a crowd of old people, the car wasn't meant for that, but I've decided incidentally to use the car for that purpose. So here's my point.
Sure. Sorry. Yes. Okay. I'm maybe being too picky.
Self-interest is a mechanism of the human being. Self-interest is not something that vacillates from time to time. Self-interest is simply a tool, like the hammer. Now, it has a purpose. It has a core function, like the hammer. Self-preservation is that core function. Now, self-preservation is connotated with a bunch of other things. The Swiss theorist, Emer D. Vattel, one of my favorite natural law theorists, I'm actually going to be including him in my thesis this summer. He said that man's rational self-love is what will animate and create his relations with everyone else. And this is a kind of a starting point that the entire Enlightenment liberal tradition with Hugo Grotius and John Locke, all of them start from this point because they recognize that we have at the very bottom, at the very bare of our existence, a desire, a natural desire. Now we can debate if this natural desire is a good thing or a bad thing. I think that self-preservation is inherently a good thing. It can be used in bad ways, but it's a good thing. We have a natural desire to preserve ourselves. And that kind of leads us. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, could I push? Maybe I push back on that a little bit.
Absolutely.
So you say we have a natural desire to do for self-preservation,
mm-hmm.
But what about people who volunteer to die in wars, or people who are ideologically possessed to, like the example I think Sam Harris uses a lot is like suicide bombers. So that self-interest is self-preservation. I don't know if is accurate.
No. I think that it's so. There's a principle that exists, and there can be aberrations of the principle, and the principle can still be real. So for example, if I have an apple, and the definition of an apple does not change, even if there is a worm inside of the apple, the worm does not become part of the definition of the apple. The apple still has an essential function, essential nature. So self-preservation has an essential function and an essential nature, and just because some people want to go blow themselves up, or some people want to go off to war. And by the way, I think that going off to war is very different than intentionally killing yourself for a political cause.
Trying to contextualize it through the self-preservation.
Yeah, very different. And I think there are ways you can go off to war and still be concerned about your self-preservation. In fact, and this is kind of where the concept progresses. So at the very base of our existence, there's self-preservation. Hey, even animals in the animal kingdom, cats, dogs, lions, all of them have this instinct. Cells. Yes, cells. Every single living thing, I'm not sure if plants do. I don't know. Don't get me. I've not studied botany.
I think it's fair. Yes, I think that's true. Plants are
maybe plants
same do. Evolutionary drive. Yes.
Yeah, maybe plants do. Yeah, actually, they probably do. They just manifest it in different ways. That's a very base instinct. Now, the difference between the human being and animalia is really, there's one main difference, but there's many more differences, right? But I'm gonna stick with one main difference for this conversation, so it doesn't go too into different areas. The fundamental difference is rationality, as Aristotle would say. Our rationality informs our self-preservation. We're about to enter into the territory of self-interest. So we've gone from self-preservation, which is the base first principle of natural life, all natural life. Then we have taken the elevator up to the second gradation of self-preservation, which is, as I mentioned before, the ability to be rational, which makes our self-preservation a little bit, yes?
Well, I was going to say, I don't know that I fully accept this. So I don't know if I fully accept that we've gotten past self-preservation as the fundamental instinct, because your point was...
No. We've not gotten past it. We are moving within the framework of self-preservation. We have not gotten past them. Actually, I think self-preservation is still... Yeah.
Okay, well, let me rephrase it. No, I don't, as of right now, I don't necessarily accept the premise that self-preservation is at the bottom of this, because your response was
Okay.
the
Why not?
apple, there's an essential principle, and then
Yes.
there's a worm in the apple that doesn't define the apple.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, so again, looking at things from let's say from a mental health perspective, of self-interest, like self-interest, to me, when I hear self-interest, it's people making decisions and making choices that are in their own self-interest,
Okay.
right? That's
yes.
So but that includes things that go against their self-preservation, right? Like people choose all the time to engage in unhealthy behavior, in destructive behavior, and there are plenty of people who are willing to die for a cause.
Sure.
And I wouldn't necessarily consider that an aberration of the principle.
I absolutely would. If you're saying that, if the principle, if you agree, okay, if you agree, now you don't agree on this, but if you accept that the principle as an axiom of natural life in general, just at an instinctual level, forget rationality, on an instinctual level with self-preservation, then it's possible for self-preservation to still be an instinct, and people still deviate from it. If the principle is still there, deviations are absolutely possible. But
sure,
that doesn't
but
mean the principle is wrong.
Sure, but and maybe this is just a straight up empirical question, but I would say the deviation is a lot. It's common enough that I wouldn't consider it an exception of.
We can talk
deviation.
about commonalities we can talk about commonalities in a moment.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And maybe it would help to move into from self-preservation to self-interest. But at the core, again, and I'm looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, there are a lot of things that human beings do that are clearly not in their own reproductive interest or their own self-interest, that are common across cultures.
Let's get into that.
Okay. Well,
let's get into that.
Well, right now, or
well, so I was trying to set up the framework for my thoughts so that you can see.
And maybe I interrupted you
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine, dude. It's fine. So it's better that we clarify things when we're in the first principle stage than to be past the first principle stage and get into trouble. And that's how mistakes and mishappenings and misunderstandings
because
arise.
I think my critiques are at that first principle level.
Okay. I get it. Okay, so let's hash some things out. Do you think instinctually natural life is concerned instinctually with self-preservation? Instinctual. This does not mean that all instances of natural life, this does not mean that every instance of natural life will automatically want to preserve themselves. It does not mean that. There can be deviations, absolutely. But on an instinctual basis, ingrained into our human being, do you not see empirically in nature, and even in humanity at large, a desire to preserve oneself? I mean, what do you call these things we have on right now? Clothes. Clothes are a sort of the end of the line of a long line of reasoning, a long line of conditioning, a long line of customs that all of us created when we came together and formed this thing we call society. Mm-hmm. Look at, I'm in a house right now. Houses were quite literally created to provide shelter from the elements. The elements in the earth is actively trying to kill humanity every single day. Structures and buildings were created for that purpose. So
sure. So I definitely agree. I definitely agree. Generally speaking, yes.
Not generally speaking.
Well, then okay. So then this is a matter of to what degree do the deviations maybe bring the principle into question. So for example, suicide rates are rapidly increasing, and they're very high at a time when you could argue that the material circumstances we find ourselves in is most conducive to self-preservation, given people's access to food and shelter, all the things you're describing.
Sure.
And yet there are many, many people at increasing rates who will, through their own choice, presumably, kill themselves.
Yeah.
And I understand, it's definitely, we shouldn't treat that as, well, this is like this is them fulfilling their own self-interest. That's a good thing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think and perhaps my criticism won't manifest itself until we get to maybe second principles, third principles, until we get into the actual manifestation. But I would say, if take it just a given individual, and this is not uncommon. If your life is so characterized by suffering, isolation, loneliness, you have no prospects in the future, your society is collapsing around you, you can make a very rational case that, you know, the best thing to do is to end your suffering. That doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't mean you should. But I think the fact that there is such increasing rates of things like suicide and things, you know, that the you know, people's circumstances are so bad in their own, by their own judgment, that they judge it better to end those circumstances through ending their own life. Now I agree that and this is more from a moral perspective, if we don't consider that a deviation, that suddenly implies, well, this is like an okay thing. And I'm not saying, I'm just trying to complicate the basic assumption that it's not necessarily self-preservation. I think the fundamental instinct to human life, I think a more accurate perspective is the instinct to meaning. I don't think self-preservation and survival is necessarily the same thing as the instinct to meaning. So Viktor Frankl, who was in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany for a period of time, he's a psychiatrist. His one of his main theories is this idea of will to meaning, that the human being has a will to not just survival, but meaningful life. And that is a different claim. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's a different claim. Now, I think to my earlier, to what I was saying earlier, I think it might be helpful if we go down the line and say, I've got, you know, I'm thinking it's will to meaning, you're thinking it's self-preservation. We could see how those diverge in the final analysis.
They are absolutely not. So you pose them as if they're mutually exclusive. Now, maybe to this gentleman that you quoted, who I'm not quite familiar with, they are, but I think that's an absolutely wrong claim.
No, I would say they're not mutually. Sorry.
Okay.
So then they're not mutually exclusive.
So you can have self-preservation and you can have a will to meaning as well.
Right, but I would say the will to meaning is more fundamental than self-preservation, because the meaningful thing to do might be to die for your belief, and that is against self-preservation, but conducive to the sense of meaning.
So we're taking a natural fact, self-preservation, and we're bringing it into a value system. Let's, without actually understanding or giving more definition and more form to the natural fact of self-preservation. So let's deal with that first, then we can get into the value system. Because if we half-bake self-preservation and then shove it into a value system, we're gonna get a half-baked answer. And half-baked answers do not help us get to the truth. They simply from our biases.
And we'll be able to hash that out.
Right. Okay, so let's get past this phase. So you at least believe that there is an instinct of self-preservation embedded in the human, or in life in general. You at least believe that.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Great. You at least believe. Yes. Okay. Good. Because if not, then we have a lot of explaining to do. We can explain a lot. I don't mind. We have a lot of explaining to do. So we agree on that. Okay. Number 2. Do you agree that instinct is dominant in anomalia, but rationality may not be dominant? Well, I won't say that it's dominant in humanity, because that is a claim of quantity, but it is embedded into our human faculties. We have the capacity to do it. Do you agree with that?
Definitely. We definitely have the capacity for rationality.
So we've established 2 things so far. We're doing good here, man. We're doing good. We've established that self-preservation at least is an instinct embedded into our life. Now we've also established that rationality is the sphere of understanding that separates human beings from anomalia in our interaction with self-preservation. Okay, this is the 3rd principle. This is where I think a lot of your critiques are answered. Now, this does not mean it's a slam dunk. It just means I think that a lot of your concerns and worries about this first axiom, and keep in mind, we're only on axiom 1. You have many more axioms that you disagree with. We're on axiom 1. We're on axiom 1 right here. The 3rd part, and this comes from Vital, this comes from Grotius, this comes from even Locke, I think, is the precondition for civil society. That our rational self-love, our capacity, not necessarily the occurrence, but our capacity to have that rational self-love is what brings us in concert with someone else. It's what brings us in intellectual and material commerce with someone else. Because we understand that the happiness of the soul, as Vital put it, it requires an indispensable relationship with other people if you're going to survive in this modern day world. We understand.
Definitely.
Okay. Oh, you agree? Okay. So we've just agreed on.
Yes. Humans are very social creatures.
Okay. We've just agreed on 3 principles. Let me restate them. Number 1, self-preservation is at least embedded into the instincts of all natural life. Definitely. Number 2, rationality is what separates the human being into a different sphere of understanding from anomalia. And number 3, a capacity for rational self-love forms the basis for interactions with other people in a collaborative setting like a society. Okay.
I accept them as I understand them. Yes.
Okay. That's basically what they are. Now, of course, there's more ways you can understand. Theorists and philosophers devote so much time to this stuff, but we're not going to really, we're going to devote some time to it, obviously. I just want to make sure people can get a clear idea of what's going on. Okay. So we've done that. Now, let's go back to the issue of deviations. Why are there suicides? Why are there suicide bombers? Why are there why are these people not acting in their self-interest, or are they acting in their self-interest? So we have a lot of things to deal with here. Let's go with depression first. So a hammer over, any tool over time, if it is not maintained and well kept, can deteriorate. Self-interest is an inborn capacity. It is a tool, but if it is not maintained and rejuvenated and enhanced with certain things, certain ideas, certain nourishment, it becomes impotent. Now, this is a perspective that many libertarians don't talk about, because many libertarians, this is a critique I have of them, think it's simply okay to say, well, it's in your self-interest, isn't it? Okay, that's good. No, there are plenty of things that can be in your self-interest, but the question is, what is motivating that self-interest? The primacy of self-interest is not so much to do with the fact that you can act in your self-interest. It has to do with the values surrounding that capacity. Just like a hammer's efficiency has to do with the skill of the worker applying that hammer's strength, applying that hammer's form onto the natural world. So we are mistaken when we say that self-interest is justified by itself. It is justified by a capacity to be rational, and that is justified by a capacity to have at least self-emboldening, self-empowering virtues and ideas within you. Now, we've gone through a few layers. Let me repeat, okay? So you have self-interest. Self-interest is like a tool. Self-interest is to the human being what a hammer is to a construction worker. If the hammer is not maintained, enhanced, rejuvenated over time, the hammer deteriorates and it becomes impotent. If the hammer is not used skillfully, it's impotent. Likewise, if our self-interest and that rational self-love that Vital mentioned is not infused into us and injected into us by either ourselves or other people or both, our ability to be self-interested deteriorates.
Agreed.
Do you get, okay, so you agree with me, okay.
Well, not only do I agree, just again, from a Petersonian perspective, you call it that, you specifically what you were just describing with someone's, if you don't maintain the hammer, the use of the hammer falls apart, it becomes impotent. That's explicitly in line with, if you, let's say, lie to yourself, or if you don't take care of yourself, that causes you to pathologize your value structure, which allows you to act in the world. So I would say that is perfectly in line with what I believe.
Okay, sure. Now, your issue is, though, you don't think that people always know or always have the ability to infuse that self-love into them, and therefore we need institutions to step in, correct?
That, and I would say, I guess, a broader critique, maybe it's a bit separate, is if we accept that people who do not maintain their I think the analogy of the hammer is good. If people who allow that hammer to become impotent, to be useless and pathologized, those people are no longer abiding by the axioms on which my understanding of libertarianism is dependent on, which is that people are rational and people are self-interest. If you lie to yourself and pathologize your ability to, know what's best for yourself, well, then, you're not going to be able to fit in an economy that is dependent on you knowing what's best for yourself.
It is mistaken to say that it is mistaken to say that libertarians believe that everyone is rational and everyone is self-interested. That is, or most people are rational.
Sure, most children definitely not.
Well, sure, beyond children,
intellectually disabled.
Forget all that. Forget all that. It is still a mistake to say that. It's a mistake to say that because libertarianism, at least, does not make that claim of quantity. Libertarianism, at least, simply makes a claim of capacity. It says we have the capacity to do these things. Now, look, having the capacity is not the same thing as having the quantity there already. So yes, libertarian contends that people have the capacity to do things. And libertarians will probably demonstrate with empirical evidence how that works out better circumstantially, or how that is more moral, principally, than government coercion or institutional force. But that principle is not invalidated if there are people who do not use their capacities. Now, the question for you is, most people, or the statement you're trying to make is that a lot of people don't understand how to use their capacities. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. How do we determine that? First question.
How do we determine that? I would say the evidence for my belief in that claim is the, let's say, skyrocketing rates of suicide, depression, anxiety. Those are all symptoms of individuals not being able to determine what is in their own best self, what is in their own self-interest. Because theoretically, if a depressed person knew it was in their, a depressed person knows it's in their own self-interest to not be depressed, and yet they still remain depressed. So there's something deeper there then. Or maybe that's an example of those people who've pathologized
keep going.
Their apparatus. So
keep going.
Well, I would say that's the primary one I'm concerned with is
depression.
Well, not just depression, but the general lack of meaning that people feel, and the general. We can put it reductively, not reductively. We can put it, depression. Let's go with that for now.
Okay, let's go with depression. So you believe that depression. Yeah. Okay. So there are different levels of depression, of course, though.
And can I clarify?
Different levels. Go on.
Yeah, there's definitely, and I do want to make this distinction, there are physiological causes of depression that are outside of people's control that you just have to take medication for. But there's also and I don't necessarily know this for a fact, but my intuition, and I assume most people share this, is there are a lot of people who are depressed because of just lack of meaning, isolation, social conditions that aren't necessarily a result of a genetic or physiological cause. And it's those people that I think are the evidence that the self-interest model, not that it's not right, but that we can't rely on those people to know what's best for them and just assume that they're going to help themselves if we just gave them the right opportunity. It's like they need structure, per se, whether that comes from religion, or that's my suspicion it comes from religion, but it might not be that.
Well, so I think, well, first of all, look, what would you say about depressed people, many of whom go to seek therapy or go to seek out help? Many of whom do.
Me being one of them. Yes.
Yeah, of course. Hey, I have clinical depression, and I felt all kind of things when I first was diagnosed about 6 years ago, and but I also knew I had other concepts in my head though. The problem is not against the deficiency of self-interest. The problem is the deficiency of available concepts. We can assume that a reasonable person, and I don't think reasonability is taken away by depression per se. Now, other things can probably impair reasonability. Maybe some more severe disorders can impair reasonability, and that's a very separate case, though. But for a depressed person or someone with anxiety, their reasonability is not necessarily impaired. It's wired a little bit differently. It's acts a little bit differently. But with the right value system, the causes of those conditions can be rebelled against. If a depressed person simply understands that what they're feeling is may be very real to them, but the content of it may not necessarily be true. If they understand that one thing, they may still feel the pain, but you now have another concept, an anti-depressive concept that is now attacking and assaulting a depressive concept. Now, if someone does not take that concept and go run with it, okay, that's a decision they made. And that may have been against their self-interest, but that desire, hold on, here's where I disagree with you. The desire to actually take that value and that concept, run with it, cannot come from another human being who is just as flawed, fundamentally, axiomatically, as we all are. Just because there is structure does not necessarily mean that structure is going to be conducive to your own health. Because fundamentally, that structure is not experiencing what you're experiencing. You see what I'm saying? That's the deficiency of structures. They are generalities. And they may have specific meaning to you, but then again, you create that meaning for you. A priest can help you, a priest can listen to you, a priest can do whatever. But if you're not really sorry, like for a confessional, the entire concept of confessions for the Catholic Church is based upon not mutual, the honesty of the confessor. The priest can, that's structure. You go into a box, the police talks to you, you say all your things. That's structure. But if you're not really honest, or you're not really sorry, or whatever, the structure is nothing more than a placebo for you to feel as if you did something because a structure said, an external source said, you're good. Emerson says the reason why geniuses, or the reason why people in general do not really embody their potential is because they forsake their own thoughts because it came from them. So this sort of externalization of the self, this sort of excessive externalization of the self does not work unless someone has a coherent value system unto themselves. So structural rationality can work if someone is honest and someone is actually trying to build a better foundation within themselves, but structural rationality does not create that better foundation. We have to do it for ourselves. That's my position.
Sure. Yes. And you definitely hit on a lot of correct. A lot of things I agree with. By the way, that Emerson, is that from Self-Reliance, the essay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
One of my favorites. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, certainly agree. People who go into confession, and if they're not willing to be honest, the confession is worthless. It's a placebo. I agree. That's Carl Rogers would say the same thing about therapy. Unless the person wants to do better, therapy is irrelevant. That's a precondition. So, like, I regard, and again, my ignorance prevents me from articulating this as well as I could, or as well as I understand it. But religious institutions, or maybe institutions in general, cultural institutions, tradition, these things exist in part because they've solved problems that were previously problems, but now we don't think about. So for example, we take it for granted that people are equal, that every person has, value as a human being, that we're all metaphorically children in the image of God, something to that effect, and that, like, the presumption of innocence, all of that. That is a very new invention. That's a very new phenomenon, because in the past, the king was, in feudalism, was considered to be closer to God, and the peasant didn't have as much divine value. And so these religious institutions, and maybe I'm using the wrong words here, but the religious principle of we're all equal before God, that's a tradition that doesn't come about from an individual's experience. That's a tradition that preceded the individual's being born, and they are concretized and they manifest themselves in things like, well, the Constitution, certainly the idea, the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. It's like the only reason why these are self-evident is because there's an entire Judeo-Christian lineage that says, of course, everyone is equal. So when it comes to, like, okay, we need rationality, it's like, I would take issue with the notion that a depressed person who, if if only they had the right set of values or the right amount of information, that person would would be able to move past their depressive state. Because I think recognizing that we are not purely rational, there's an element of discipline that comes in the form of what I would call institutions. The simplest one I can think of, or maybe a good metaphor analogy, is parent to child. A child, you can explain to a child, this is why you should do these things, and I can provide you with this value system. But you need the parent there to say, no, I don't care what your rationalization in or out of this is. You're doing this whether you like it or not. And that doesn't map onto fully grown adults. But I think the fact that children are some blend of rational and irrational, and maybe in generally speaking, they're more irrational than rational compared to adults. But that same principle that fully grown adults who are depressed could be irrational or are irrational, and we need institutions to, and again, I need to refine this idea a lot better to come up with an exact example, but we need institutions to institute that sort of discipline of no. Like, it's not a matter of rationalizing your way out of depression. It's something else.
So I don't disagree that institutions are a valuable way to help the self become better. But I do disagree that institutions have to be sort of mutually exclusive with our own considerations of our own self-interest. I do disagree that institutions somehow have some sort of superior knowledge that we don't have access to, that can change history, change the world, change themes, and that we need to subordinate ourselves to make sure that we are, doing the best for us. No, I don't think that. Institutions, axiomatically, definitionally, don't have the capacity to understand the depth of my thoughts, the depth of my desires. Now, even the most trained psychologists would tell you there are plenty of people that they can only, understand through certain things they exhibit, but not really understand exactly what motivates them. Some of the most horrible criminals of our age, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, many of us still don't understand what could drive us to such evil and wretched depths. Institutions cannot understand what could drive them. We have ideas. Oh, well, maybe they were abused. Maybe they had this misfiring. But again, this does not explain the depths of it. There are many things that motivate someone. Emotions and intellect are spiritual quantities. What do I mean by this? I don't mean in terms of ghosts or spirits or deities. I mean,
I'd hope not. That'd make this conversation a lot more complicated.
No. I mean that these things, emotions and intellect, are only manifested, firstly through our will, and secondly through this sort of consortium of sound that emerges from my mouth that is structured as words. Those two things allow us to manifest our innards. Problem is, most human beings don't manifest their innards or the entirety of their innards, which leaves the institution with a very limited amount of information. And let's stop talking about this in a macro way. It's kind of weird. Institutions are nothing more than compositions of people. People who have their own issues, people who have their own flaws, people who have their own demons. Institutions are nothing more the compositions of people. Now, in a broad sense, sorry.
I was going to say, and this is my fault for not articulating this better. Institution. So for example, an example I'm thinking of is the Bible. The Bible is not an institution. Obviously, the church is an institution, but Christianity, broadly speaking, includes both the Bible and its principles, as well as the institutionalization of them. The Bible, what I think a text like the Bible, and I would extend this to the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or the Hindu text. I don't know it well enough to act like I can pronounce it. But any religious text, I think, acts as a compendium of knowledge that was solved 2,000 years ago or whatever period of time. There are problems that were solved by human beings thousands of years ago. How do we live together? How do we get along? And we can go into the details of what I mean by that. But then those values are instilled in our culture before we're born. We take these things as self-evident. Rationality as a highest value is only a recent development in the course of human history, right?
Right.
So so we're operating within that. Well, okay. Well, I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, the emphasis on rationality and thinking and philosophy and society is pretty recent enlightenment, but the practice of rationality has been around since the dawn of man.
Sure, the practice of rationality has already been around, but
So even
rationality as a fundamental value or the highest value, I think that's sort of the definition of the Enlightenment. Isn't that what the Enlightenment was?
Sure. Well,
was bringing rationality
over.
over.
Yeah, it was. But I don't think that humanity catches up with itself, and we've been playing catch up for a very long time, and we have been using rationality since the dawn of man. I mean, this is how everything rose. This is how.
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
And so we caught up to ourselves, and that's the important thing there. Us valuing rationality does not make it more or less powerful. We're still using it. Its place in society suddenly becomes a little bit more pronounced, but we'd still be using it. We're still using it, even when we,
sure.
even when we. So I don't think that really. I get what you're trying to say, but I don't think that really has any real effect on the practice. The principle.
Well, itself. I would say, and maybe we need to parse out the definitions better. Definitely, the capacity for rationality is sort of what makes humans humans, and that's existed for as long.
And
as
that's been yeah, exactly.
Right, but and unless you have a different understanding of it, my understanding of the Enlightenment is exactly the elevation of rationality and maybe, I don't know, this might be
that's one of the
objective
things.
Truth over these instinctual institutions that we just say, well, this is how it's been, so we're going to go with it. Whereas rationality says, well, let's analyze it instead of just accepting it, and that's very powerful. But there are some problems that are so deep. There are some issues that are so fundamental that if we hold it to the light of rationality, it destroys the very foundations on which we act. Like, for example, that human beings have intrinsic self-worth and that all of us are equal. There's no, and maybe we can have this discussion. I don't know if you define yourself as a secular humanist or anything like that, but I would argue there's no rational way to say that a human being has intrinsic value in and of themselves and shouldn't be treated as such. Well, what would the rational case for that be?
Well, very simple.
Right, it's a faith claim. It's a faith claim saying there's something about consciousness.
I can demonstrate. No. I can demonstrate that I have value by, number one, my capacity and what my capacity entails. My capacity to rationality entails that I can also access the fruits of rationality, which are my rights. And all rights are the individual capacities for me to get to live in the world. My right to life, for example, is an individual capacity for me to live in the world. My right to liberty is an individual capacity and justification for me not to be bothered in my process in the world. And my right to property is not simply my right to material things. It is my right of self-ownership over me, which justifies fundamentally my right to be left alone. So no, I think our value is embedded in our capacity for rationality and how rationality automatically, even if we don't realize it, automatically interacts with those ontological truths. Even if we reject them, even if we don't realize it, the people in North Korea still have rights. They still have fundamental intrinsic rights, even if we don't believe it. So no, I do think there's something fundamentally intrinsic about the human being that I can ascertain, that I can reason, that reason can tell me actually exists. Absolutely, 100%.
Sure, but okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Plus, it's not just reason that's saying this. It's, well, reason gets me to this position, but it's also laws of logic, the laws of non-contradiction. Liberty is the natural state of the human being. Liberty is simply my natural state of acting in absence of interference. And that cannot be contradicted logically. So I think there are plenty of axiomatic reasons as to why we have value in work.
Okay, well, let me pose you this example. I'm part of tribe A, you're part of tribe B. We occupy the same land. There's scarce resources. Why shouldn't I just wipe your tribe out? It's in my own self-interest to wipe all of you out and not treat you as individuals. If we have scarce resources,
no,
that's certainly been the entire history of humanity.
Yes, and why do you think those civilizations almost always failed? So look, I agree with you.
We are subject to those drives.
No. They didn't fail because we're subject to them. They fell because they weren't acting in their self-interest. And I agree with you. People can aberrate from their self-interest. The
I
civilization
wouldn't
is
say that's
actually
aberration. I would say, and this is important, I would say it's we are animals fundamentally, and it is the fundamental nature of us as animals and predators to not only, you know, kill other prey and obstacles, but kill each other. Absolutely. We are virtually evolved to do that.
The distinctive nature of man is his mind being over his matter. The distinctive nature of man is his rationality being able to usurp his passions and his base instinctual drives. That's what separates us from beasts. So you can't just say, well, we are evolutionary primed to kill people, therefore we kill people. No, there's more, especially in a world of society and customs and all kind of things, an understanding of these intrinsic values which animate our human being, an understanding of liberty. In a world such as that, human motivation is much more complex than simple evolutionary biology. Now, I understand that evolutionary biology does play a role into the foundation of our human being, but I do not believe, for the reasons I've stated, that it is the fundamental end-all, be-all, established idea of how we act. It is not a prescriptive.
Sure.
It's not a prescriptive means. It's a descriptive means.
Yes, and I think this reveals the fundamental disagreement, because I'm on the exact opposite side. I think there is not a single thing we can say about human nature that cannot and should not be interpreted through the lens of evolutionary psychology, let's say. So
I didn't
for
say
example,
that. I didn't say that.
Okay.
Sorry,
I might have misinterpreted.
That we're not a slave to our evolutionary instincts. That's what I said. Or let me use a less loaded term.
Sure. Okay.
We don't have to be motivated by our base instincts because we have rationality, which can tell us if our base instincts are actually just, unjust, good, or bad.
We don't. This is definition. We don't have to act upon our base instincts, but we certainly are motivated by them. The desire the desire for aggression is permanent. That's permanent. That's built into our biology. The desire for sexual reproduction, the desire for, you know, satiation of hunger, all of that. Those are all built into our biology.
Sure,
but so let me pose you this point, because this is when I go to when we're talking about these things. So if you think about like Nazi Germany or the USSR or any number of 20th century, you know, countries, nations that did horrible, horrible things, those for the people who were in those countries and who benefited from whatever those policies were, would it not have been rational? Like, let's say you were a German in 1940s Germany, it would have been rational for you, the German, to go along with the Nazi regime, because it would have benefited you and your family and everyone around you, and it would have killed other people.
No.
But I would argue it would have been rational at the time to do that.
No, not by the definition that the libertarian tradition would give you. No, it wouldn't have.
I'm not on. Yes.
No, it wouldn't have been. No, it wouldn't have been. Now, look, I'll say this: you can say, if we want to detach rationality from the natural law tradition, you can easily say, oh yeah, it'd be rational. And guess what? Max Stirner, that egotistic guy who was an anarchistic philosopher who said that morality is a spook and I can go ahead and I can do whatever I want to do to someone. Oh, he was absolutely in favor of what you're saying right now.
Okay, I think you're right. So then because I guess my argument that I'm making would be against that. We definitely cannot detach reality from. I think we should hash out what you mean by natural rights or natural
of course,
law.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, for the libertarian tradition, and more broadly the natural law tradition, which predates the libertarian tradition, and in many ways is the foundation for it, although there are libertarians or utilitarians and other kind of things. But for the libertarian tradition at large, self-interest means, as Emery Vital put it, and on the essay of the first principle of natural law, it means rational self-love. And rational self-love is not merely a statement of conditions. It's a statement of values that is birthed from that condition. So the fact according to libertarians, the fact that we have rationality and we have that instinct of self-preservation, and we therefore have the capacity to self-interest, necessitates that we have a certain set of values to go along with that, So someone in Nazi Germany who was holding the natural law set of values, well, first of all, they would have been abhorred. Second of all, they would not have acquiesced, or they would not have tried to acquiesce to everything. They would have probably been undercover. They would have probably just had, not protest or anything like that. But they would understand that they are not obligated by the rationality, or they're not justified by feigned rationality to commit evil. What did Hannah Arendt said? Hannah Arendt said that you always have a choice between committing an evil act and not committing an evil act. And if not committing the evil act means that you die, you die. The libertarian tradition, or at least a good understanding of it, does not leave wiggle room for subjectivism and over-contextualization. It has absolute principles that are there. And guess what? If violating those principles, or not violating those principles rather, means you die, you die.
So would you agree that those principles are not necessarily arrived on through purely rational logic, but are principles that are in and of themselves unquestionable, like God is an axiom in and of himself?
Well, so I don't think the idea of God is unquestionable, and I think that there is a secular basis for.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. I do believe that a lot of these things are indeed axioms, but hey, look, here's the problem in philosophy. We can say they're axioms, but the problem is there are so many different people with different dispositions that may disagree with their status as axioms. So the debate always comes, okay, is this really an axiom? Now, if it's really an axiom, there shouldn't be much debate because it's self-evident. But but no, I do think these things are axioms. Yes, you can, and I'm not doing like Kant did. I'm not just going into the air and reasoning all this stuff. No. I'm looking at reality. I'm looking at what I have as a human being, my capacities, my powers, as Emerson would say. I'm looking at the values that are necessary to use those things justly in accordance to the principles that I mentioned previously. And I'm applying that in a political setting. And ultimately, in that input-output table outcome, libertarianism becomes the way to do that. So no, it's not simply about, here's the thing I think that you maybe, hopefully you have a better understanding of it now. For libertarians, live and let live is a very poor way of articulating our philosophy. In fact, if there is anyone listening to the sound of my voice who dares say live and let live, socially liberal, physically conservative, you need to stop acting under the auspices of libertarianism, because you are defiling hundreds of years of a powerful intellectual tradition which established the basis for the American experiment, which animated the thoughts and the pen of brilliant men like Jefferson, like Dickinson, like Adams, like Madison. You are doing a disgrace to the ideology that you profess to hold. If someone simply condenses libertarianism down to that one phrase, I have nothing to do with them. Now, this may seem harsh. I'm trying to be harsh for a reason. I love everyone, and I'm sure. Look. Many of my followers, I have to make sure that I can explain things clearly. That's my issue. So, but I try to avoid this trap.
Passionately, for sure.
And passionately, I try to avoid this trap, though. This is the trap that was referred to by a certain singer that I'm not going to quote because that would make my pensive image look bad. But this is a trap. Libertarianism is not about live and let live. Libertarianism is non-interference in the context and understanding of virtuous values. And those virtuous values are not simply non-interference. Non-interference, as the state of nature theory would say, is simply the natural condition of the human being. Now, when you come into society, that's the sale. For Locke, civil society is meant to protect that axiom. But most of the time, it's a sale. It's a tact. So, you don't simply say live and let live. You understand what live and let live means in terms of values, because that itself is a statement of a value that necessarily has to occur in a certain context for it to be feasible. And this goes back to natural law understanding of rationality as being indicative, or as rational self-love as being indicative of the proper way to exercise our capacity to reason, the proper way to exercise our self-interest. Are there folks who disagree with this or who aberrate from it? All the time. Sometimes because they don't have these very basic values in their head, even though their existence proves these values do exist, or because they outright reject these values and think that self-interest is evil and communitarianism and altruism are the ways to go. They're a different case. Or because genuinely they just don't have knowledge in general of life. I think that life itself has lessons to teach us. It teaches us these lessons in very different ways, of course, but I do think that there are similarities in the human experience, and someone like Jung would absolutely agree. I mean, Jung thinks that we are all connected conceptually by this grand unconscious. So I don't go that far. Yes. I don't go that far. And
sure.
and
not yet you don't. Not yet you don't.
No, I'm not going that far.
We'll see.
But you know, and Emerson says there is nothing that did not come out of the mind of Plato, Newton, Galileo that's not in your mind. So there is this rich tradition under the auspices of the American experiment that, hey, no, we are connected and we have these concepts in this sort of conceptual headspace. I'm simply saying the fact that we experience things and we experience things on the common ground, not in terms of us experiencing the same things, but particularly in the context of America, the common ground being the principles of America, the government of America, the fact that we are united by the American idea, the idea of Americanism, even if we have different ideas about what that means, simply means that we have some similarities in our experience, or we should have some similarities in our experience. So let me just rephrase. The proper understanding of self-interest and rationality, they are capacities. They are capacities that are indispensable to a functioning life, which is where rationality kind of is like autopilot, but sometimes it's skewed and people go against the principle. But the principle itself also is not simply rationality. It is rationality surrounded by a set of values, by a statement and affirmation of values that tie corely down to the idea of rational self-love, that tie down, and that goes out to building social bonds, you know, meeting people, being friends, building community.
Right.
So
I think I'm much more encouraged and appreciative of that perspective. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
Institutions, I'm about to blow your mind. Institutions play a key role in all of this, but they are not the genesis of this. Even if, and let me address this argument because I didn't address it, even if I am predated by something, it predating me and it giving an answer about a topic that has been around in the consciousness for thousands of years does not necessarily mean that my own perspective or my own understanding of that, let me rephrase. It does not mean they have reached the truth. Because and ultimately, let me be honest with you, my perspective and my understanding only matters insofar as I am getting to the truth. I don't have my own truth. I don't have my own facts. I don't have my own ethics. I don't even have my own life, in all honesty. I think that I'm owned by God. And I know you're an atheist, I think. So we can talk about that later.
It's hard to, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of in between right now.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. You know, and this is kind of where I kind of struggle with the natural law principles of ownership, because, you know, I'm more of a Lockean in that I believe that we are all property of God. And that means that, all that means is that, you know, if I own myself fully and I'm my own property, and then that means that if I want to go ahead and kill myself, I can go ahead and do that ethically. But
do you think?
But sorry, go on.
Do you think everything you said up, and I agree, and I I respect that. Do you think that the perspective that you just offered, can that exist, that you've arrived at personally? Do you think that that can be maintained and exist outside of a belief in God? If you did not have the personal relationship
Yes.
you have with your religious
Yes.
belief.
Yes. Yes, I still think that you can have the capacity for rational self-love, which leads to relationships with these institutions, without having God there. I think
That's just one
I think
method.
it's yeah. So Hugo Grotius, who kind of, again, is one of my intellectual inspirations, he said that even if the most unfortunate truth is a fact, that there is no God, my system still works. Now, Grotius was a very Christian, but he understood, like all intellectuals do, the need to step outside of ourselves, understand we exist in a world that is not defined by ourselves and is defined by many things, that we have to speak to those many things. So yes, it can exist. People can believe in natural rights. People can believe in rationality as a means of self-love, and self-love as a means of establishing social bonds, and that as a means of forming institutions, that as a means of social cohesion. You can believe in all of that and still not believe in God, but it's harder, in my opinion. But it's possible.
I agree.
It's possible.
Interesting.
And this is one of the reasons why Peterson is so rooted in spirituality. And in fact, Peterson himself is about to come. I think he's about to make a conversion. If he hasn't already. I have heard him speak. I've seen him break down and cry about Jesus. I mean, I've seen him talk about the conceptual realm and all. And I'm just thinking to myself, this guy's on the brink of converting.
Yeah, that'll pose interesting problems for me if he ends up doing that.
Oh, yes.
So we have to reevaluate that.
But anyway, was this productive?
I absolutely. And I think
any more to add? Yeah.
Well, no, I think, and just for me, the most valuable insight, or most valuable thing you said, just from my perspective, selfishly, was when you clarified, I forget the gentleman's name you were referencing. I assume it was you don't believe that rationality can be separate from morality. Who said morality was a spook or was
that was Max Stirner, who thinks that morality and ethics
right,
are spooks.
And you disagree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And I think, and I would say, to the degree that I came into this conversation, I didn't have that articulated, but now that you have articulated that is a specific thing that is not only wrong, but worthy of ridicule and condemnation.
Yes.
That I think we're much more aligned than I would have originally.
And this is not just the natural law tradition saying this. This is also Ayn Rand, who is an atheist, who doesn't believe in natural law, saying this as well. She thinks you cannot have a rational self-interest without a system of ethics behind it, which is why she believes in individual rights and that sort. So yeah, no.
So yes.
And it's good to iron these things out like this, because this is a critique that many folks, especially many traditional conservative, have libertarians. Oh, you guys don't know what's best for yourself. You're so assailed by all kind of ills and deformities, and humanity needs structure. Well, yeah, humanity. I think that structure really helps. It helps us hone ourselves sometimes. But our deformities, our troubles in this world, we are weighed against them every day. And the progression of the human race to this point in 2021 AD is simple evidence that we have gotten to a level that we can stand in spite of our deformities. We can stand in spite of our shortcomings. Our shortcomings, no matter how much they assail our ability and our capacity to love ourselves, no matter how much they assail our ability and our capacity to commerce with others, no matter how much they assail our ability and our capacity to do things that are necessary for a free society, our deformities don't define us. They refine us actively and every day. And this is not just Christian Watson saying this. Natural selection. Who survives? The fittest. Well, a little bit more than that. The smartest. The smartest survive. Not just the fittest, the smartest in the animal kingdom. If that little pup knows not to wander from the wolf pack at nighttime and go out into the forest where all other, he'll survive probably. If he does that, yikes. And that pup probably actually has more limitations and more issues than a human being has with decision making, because he's motivated entirely by instinct. And yet that natural principle animates his entire pack's ability to live. It's the same for us, in my opinion. There are some who will say, no, Christian, the institution is indispensable. I think for the reasons I said and explained, the institutions are helpful, and in many instances, they may even be necessary, but they are not a necessary condition for me to understand what's best for me. They may be a necessary aid or a helpful aid for me to refine and get to a point where I can interact with what is best for me in the fullest of ways. But even then, it's not the institution, it's how I received them. So again, it goes back to my will, my discretion, my jurisdiction. That
Well,
thing right there.
we definitely align more now than we did at the beginning of this conversation. That's
And it's fine if you still disagree. That's totally fine.
Well, yeah, and even as I hear what you're saying, it's not even necessarily disagreement, because I hear you phrase things in a way that I might not accept on the face value, but when you explain it more and then you talk about other things, I'm putting this broader picture together where I think if we aligned on definitions and
Right.
just learned each other's language, we'd end up agreeing fully or coming to some different.
That's why I spent a lot of time on the first principles part, defining things and fleshing things out.
And
absolutely.
Right, exactly. So
absolutely.
Yes, I think this conversation was excellent as far as I'm
concerned. Yeah. Well, look, I know you may not agree with everything entirely, but I appreciate you coming, Paul, onto the channel, onto the podcast. I appreciate you dealing with me preaching to you for about an hour and however many minutes. Yeah, I was preaching, man. That's what I always do.
Well, you preach good stuff. So if there's a reason people go to church, because when the preacher says good things and valuable information, it's useful. So
right, absolutely. So
definitely the case here.
I hope you come back. Thank you for being a fan and a contributor to my channel.
Oh yes,
I'm blessed to have someone who is as intellectually adventurous and intelligent as you, watching me on a regular basis, and if not approving, at least appreciating what I say and what I do. That's a blessing. I hope you didn't feel condescended or belittled or anything in this conversation. Hope you didn't feel like that.
If I did, then that would be on me and my lack of character development. So that would be a me issue. But I did not. I did not. So I really appreciate it, Chris, and I will definitely be commenting on your videos in agreement and disagreement wherever it's warranted.
Please, no, and please come back. And let this be an open invitation to anyone out there. If any of you want to debate or converse with me about anything within my field of expertise, let's go do it. Don't talk to me about agricultural science or marine biology. I can't help you there. I can't. But you want to talk about philosophy, most political issues, I mean, I'm all for it. And really, again, my experiment here is to converge the political with the human and the human with the political. I always say this. What do I mean? Politics has become so intertwined in our human experience and existence that it necessarily interacts with and contains specimens of our desires and our wills. We got to see how those specimens connect with the structure of government. We got to see how the structure of government connects to the social discourses that happen below government in society, on the internet forums, in the public squares, as they call them. We got to investigate that union if we're actually going to be able to muddle through all these waters and get something that is at least close to the truth. So that's my last word. Paul, do you have any last words?
Amen to that.
Oh, very nice of you. All right, my friends. All right, that was a lot. I just came back from a road trip too, so that was interesting.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I mean, but no, I'm always, again, anyone out there want to do this, please let me know. Email me. My email is officialcwatson@gmail.com. Actually, let me plug my other stuff too. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook at officialcwatson. That's very important. Patreon.com/officialcwatson and PayPal, which is my email, officialcwatson@gmail.com. All those things are indispensable to helping me continue to do my work here and helping me continue to, as Emerson said, hold my value to the highest bidder and keep pushing it forward. And he didn't say it like this. He was much more eloquent than I am, but you get my point. Keep pushing it forward and keep enshrining it into the hearts of men. So, Paul, once again, thank you. And everyone else who's watching this, thank you as well. And what do I always say at the end of my videos? Paul, you say it this time.
Oh, I'm blanking now. What is it?
Stay
pensive, everyone.
Bye, guys. See ya.